Welcome to our deep dive into why nations fail.
Oh yeah, this one's a classic.
It really is, and today we're exploring the book by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson.
They really try to get to the bottom of what makes some nations flourish while others, well, don't.
Exactly, and get ready for some thought-provoking
Oh,
comparisons.
there are a few surprises in there too, you'll see.
Now, the author's central argument is that it's not just about those usual suspects.
You know, like geography or culture.
Right. Instead, they emphasize the power of institutions.
Yeah, institutions. They really shape a nation's destiny.
So let's unpack this idea of institutions.
I'll make sure.
What are we actually talking about here? What do they mean by institutions?
Well, they kick things off with a fascinating comparison. Just imagine, like two cities
Okay.
right next to each other, only separated by a fence. One city is thriving, higher incomes, better health care, you name it.
Sounds pretty good.
The other, not so much. Facing poverty, limited prospects, a real struggle.
That sounds almost dystopian.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Is this like a fictional scenario they've made up?
Actually, no. It's a real place.
Really?
Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
One in the USA and one in Mexico.
Exactly. Literally separated by a fence, but drastically different outcomes.
That's wild. Same people, same location, different outcomes.
And that's precisely the point. Acemoglu and Robinson argue that this boils down to, you guessed it, the institutions.
So how do institutions create such a huge difference? Like, what are the mechanics of that?
Well, they break it down into two main types, extractive and inclusive.
Okay, two flavors of institutions. What are extractive institutions?
Those are designed to concentrate power and wealth.
Concentrate it in the hands of...
A small elite.
Ah, so it benefits just a select few.
At the expense of, well, everyone else.
That sounds familiar. Reminds me of, like, the Spanish colonization of South America.
Perfect example. The conquistadors extracting gold, the encomienda system.
Yeah, where indigenous populations were forced to labor for the Spanish elite. Awful.
And of course, let's not forget those infamous silver mines of Potosi.
Extracting wealth for the Spanish crown while exploiting the native population.
Precisely. It all points to that same pattern. A small elite grabbing wealth at the expense of the majority.
And the Mita system, forcing natives to work in those silver mines, just reinforces that.
Absolutely. Funneling wealth to a select few.
It's interesting, though, because these patterns weren't limited to just, like, the colonial era.
Oh, not at all.
Similar systems existed elsewhere, right?
Right. You see it in the Cuba Kingdom, even some Mayan city-states.
So across different continents and historical periods, we see this recurring theme.
Extractive systems, designed to benefit the elite, often with devastating consequences.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of extractive institutions. What about inclusive ones, then? How are those different?
Well, inclusive institutions are, well, more inclusive, obviously.
And okay, but how does that play out in practice? What makes them inclusive?
Think about wider participation in society.
More people having a say, more people benefiting.
Exactly. They protect property rights, ensure a level playing field, and crucially, encourage innovation.
So it's about creating an environment where more people have the opportunity to succeed.
And contribute to society.
Yeah,
And that leads to, well, overall prosperity.
makes sense. Now, thinking about inclusive institutions, it brings to mind the English colonies in North America.
Interesting.
How so?
Well, they developed those representative assemblies, right, where colonists had a voice in their governance.
Ah, I see your point. Compared to the Spanish colonies, it seems like a significant move towards inclusivity, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. While not perfect by any means, the development of English colonies, especially after those initial Jamestown struggles, illustrates a shift.
A shift in what way?
It was no longer just about extracting wealth. They had to create systems that encourage their own people to participate.
To work, to innovate.
Exactly. A real key distinction.
And it makes you think about how specific events, those turning points, can really change a nation's trajectory.
Oh, absolutely. The authors even have a name for them. Critical junctures.
Like forks in the road, moments where things could have gone in a completely different direction.
Yeah, and those turning points are crucial. Even something as devastating as the Black Death, for example.
The plague that ravaged Europe. Horrible.
It was, but it also disrupted the feudal system. It empowered peasants who were no longer tied to the land.
And that led to...
Demands for greater rights, and ultimately contributed to institutional change.
Wow, that's a fascinating insight. So even a catastrophe can create an opening.
You see, even out of those dark times, positive change can emerge.
And speaking of turning points, the book also delves into the impact of the Atlantic trade.
Ah, yes, on those different European nations.
And they contrast England's rise with Spain's decline during that period.
Right, right. England, with its, let's say, more inclusive institutions, was able to really capitalize on the opportunities of that trade.
While Spain, fixated on that extraction of wealth from its colonies,
They ultimately missed out on those long-term benefits.
the benefits of broader economic participation, of innovation,
It's a tale of two paths.
it really makes you wonder, why do societies, even when faced with these opportunities, often resist change?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it seems counterintuitive, right?
It does. Why resist change, especially if it leads to greater prosperity, at least in theory?
The authors explore a couple interesting reasons.
Okay, let's hear them.
One is the fear of what they call creative destruction.
Creative destruction. That sounds a little ominous.
Well, think of it this way. New technologies and industries often disrupt existing ones.
Ah, I see. So progress can come at a cost.
Right. It can lead to job losses, social unrest. All that uncertainty can make people nervous.
And they use that story about William Lee, right, to illustrate this point.
Exactly.
He invented this knitting machine way back in the 16th century, but Queen Elizabeth I, she wasn't having it.
Refused to grant him a patent.
Fearing the potential for, well, all those things we just talked about.
Yep. Unemployment and instability. It shows that even well-intentioned leaders can be hesitant.
When faced with change that threatens the established order, even if it's ultimately for the better.
And then there's the whole issue of vested interests.
Vested interests, okay. I think I have an idea of what that means, but could you explain?
Think of it like this. If you were, say, the only baker in town,
The only game in town cornering the market.
would you welcome some new technology that makes bread cheaper?
Probably not if it meant losing my monopoly and profit.
Precisely. The elite, those with power and wealth, often have a strong incentive to block progress, even if it would benefit society as a whole.
And the book offers some compelling examples of this, right?
Oh, yeah. Absolutist rulers in Europe, Austria, Hungary, Russia, for instance,
They actively worked to stifle technological and economic advancements.
to maintain their grip on power, even if it meant sacrificing broader prosperity for everyone else.
So this is why extracted institutions tend to be so persistent.
Right. Change is a threat to those at the top.
And that persistence leads to what the authors call the vicious circle, right?
Exactly. It's like this downward spiral. Extractive institutions become self-reinforcing.
Okay, unpack that for me. How does that work exactly?
The concentration of wealth and power, well, it hinders innovation and opportunity for the majority.
So it keeps most people trapped in a cycle of poverty, limited prospects.
Yeah, it's a tough cycle to break. They provide examples like the Jim Crow laws in the post-Civil War South.
Designed to maintain racial segregation and inequality.
You're hindering progress for generations.
Or Sierra Leone, even after independence, they struggled to break free from those extractive systems.
Demonstrating just how entrenched these patterns can be.
And the devastating impact of the slave trade on African societies. It really intensified conflicts there.
Undermining state development for centuries.
It's tragic how those ripple effects can last for so long. So we've got this vicious circle of extractive institutions. Is there like a positive counterpart to that? Is there any way to break free?
Thankfully, there is. They contrast it with the virtuous circle that comes from inclusive institutions.
Okay, so tell me about this virtuous circle.
Imagine broad participation, a level playing field, and incentives for innovation, all working together.
Creating a positive feedback loop.
Precisely, leading to sustainable growth and prosperity.
And that, in turn, strengthens those inclusive institutions.
Exactly. It builds on itself, creating a more just and prosperous society.
Can you give me an example of this virtuous circle in action?
Think about the evolution of democratic reforms in Britain. Over centuries, those movements for greater rights and representation.
They gradually expanded the circle of participation.
Exactly. And that led to a more inclusive and prosperous society.
Or the role of the media and social movements in the USA, always pushing for greater transparency, accountability.
Ensuring that power remains distributed and responsive to the people.
So there's hope.
Oh, there's always hope.
Even if a nation is stuck in a vicious circle, there's a possibility of shifting towards a virtuous one.
It's about creating the right conditions.
But how do these shifts actually happen?
Well, That's the question we'll explore further. The book highlights some real-world examples of nations defying expectations.
Nations that have managed to transition towards greater inclusivity?
Yes. One that stands out is Botswana.
Botswana, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating case. They defied the odds.
Yeah, Botswana really stands out. You hear so much about the challenges facing post-colonial Africa. It's almost like a beacon of hope.
Creating a relatively stable and prosperous democracy. It's pretty impressive.
What's their secret, do you think? How did they manage to pull it off?
Well, it seems to be a mix of internal factors and just smart choices they made along the way. They had these pre-colonial traditions that actually emphasize, get this, consultation and consensus building.
Really? That's pretty unique for pre-colonial Africa. I mean, most of what we hear is about, well, the opposite. The authors mentioned something called Kagatla, right?
Gutla, yeah, those were public assemblies.
What went on there? Chiefs would consult with their people before making decisions. It wasn't just like a top-down rule.
Interesting. So they had this tradition of inclusivity, and it somehow survived colonial rule.
It did. And even more surprisingly, it was nurtured after independence.
It sounds like their leaders really understood the value of those traditions.
Leaders like Seretse Khama, Botswana's first president, he was key.
They didn't just try to, copy models from elsewhere. They built on what they already had.
And they were deliberate about it. Chose policies that encouraged participation, distributed the benefits of growth.
Didn't fall into the trap of just exploiting their diamond wealth either.
Right. It's not just about having resources. It's about how you manage them.
They invested in education, infrastructure, public services, created opportunities for a wider segment of society.
And that's what sets them apart.
It shows that it's possible to create a path toward inclusivity and prosperity, even for a nation without a long history of democracy.
You don't have to follow the same blueprint.
So, Botswana is a case where those internal factors and smart leadership really aligned. But what about situations where the push for inclusivity comes from outside?
Ah, yeah, external pressure. That's interesting too.
The book looks at the U.S. South after the Civil War.
Right, a perfect example of how external forces can drive change.
We talked about those vicious circles, those extractive institutions persisting in the form of Jim Crow laws, but eventually that system was dismantled.
Leading to some significant advancements. Civil rights, economic opportunities, the whole landscape changed.
It's a powerful reminder that even those deeply rooted systems of inequality, they can be challenged.
Change is possible.
Although, let's be honest, it often takes a long and difficult struggle. Think about the civil rights movement, all those who fought for equality.
A federal intervention, landmark Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah.
It took a concerted effort.
And it's easy to forget just how much effort and sacrifice went into that.
People put their lives on the line.
They paved the way for the progress we see today.
It's important to remember that.
And it's interesting, too, how economic transformations played a role in the South.
Yeah, as the South industrialized, urbanized,
That old plantation economy, it faded.
the need for a more inclusive system, it became more and more apparent. Times were changing.
Okay, so we've seen how inclusivity can stem from those internal dynamics, like in Botswana,
Right.
and how it can be driven by that external pressure, as in the U.S. South. But what about when you have both?
Both internal and external forces at play.
Exactly. The case of China comes to mind.
Ah, China. Always a fascinating and complex case.
It's more nuanced, that's for sure, but it really gets at the heart of this interplay between economic and political institutions. Remember how we talked about China's economic growth after the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah, pretty remarkable.
But they're still operating under a one-party system.
Tight control over political power.
So economic inclusivity without the political inclusivity, how do the authors make sense of that?
Well, they argue that China's growth was fueled by a combination of factors, really.
Like what? What were the key ingredients?
Those market reforms unleashed this incredible wave of entrepreneurial energy.
People were ready to seize those opportunities.
The country opened up to foreign investment, technology, and they invested heavily in education.
So they adopted some of the key features of inclusive economic institutions.
But without loosening that political control,
It's a delicate balancing act.
they basically realized they could maintain their grip on power while allowing for some degree of economic freedom.
But is that sustainable long term? I mean, can a nation experience that kind of growth without eventually making a transition towards greater political inclusivity?
It's the million-dollar question. The authors point out that China's growth has actually slowed down a bit recently.
So maybe those cracks are starting to show.
There are those growing concerns about inequality, social unrest, These things tend to go hand in hand.
So while China's story is remarkable, it's not without its challenges.
And it raises some interesting questions about the future.
It sounds like the authors are suggesting that without those further political reforms, China might hit a wall.
It's one interpretation, for sure. But, history is full of surprises. There's no single path.
China could chart a new course.
Who knows? Maybe they'll find a way to combine that economic dynamism with a more, let's say, authoritarian political system.
It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds. It just feels counterintuitive, though. You'd think economic progress would naturally lead to demands for greater political freedom.
It seems logical, doesn't it?
If people are experiencing greater prosperity, wouldn't they want more say in how their country is run?
You'd think so. But history tells a different story. Economic growth and authoritarian rule, they can coexist, sometimes for a long time.
So how do those in power manage to pull that off? How do they prevent that push for greater political participation?
Well, they get creative. They often find ways to control the benefits of that economic growth.
So instead of those benefits being widely distributed,
They might enrich themselves, their allies, keep the wealth concentrated at the top.
so they capture the gains of economic growth and use those gains to maintain their control. It's pretty cynical when you think about it.
It is. The point the authors are driving at is that those extractive institutions are incredibly resilient.
They've got a vested interest in resisting change, in keeping things as they are.
Back to that vicious circle, right? It's a self-perpetuating system, really hard to break free.
But it happens sometimes, right? Those changes do occur. What are the factors that tip the scales? What makes greater inclusivity possible?
That's where the authors really get into the nitty-gritty. One key insight, those critical junctures we were talking about earlier.
Those moments in history, those specific events that create an opening for change.
Think about the Black Death, for example.
Yeah.
Disrupted the whole system, created the space for something new.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a shock to the system to shake things up.
And these critical junctures, they can come from anywhere.
Wars, revolutions, natural disasters. We talked about the Black Death. Even technological breakthroughs can be disruptive.
The point is, they create those possibilities.
But even with the opportunity, you need people willing to seize it, right?
Exactly. You need that push for change.
People who are ready to fight for something better.
And that's where the idea of broad coalitions comes in. Groups of people from diverse backgrounds, united by that common goal.
The more people on board, the better. Makes sense.
Like the Glorious Revolution in England. Merchants, industrialists, members of the gentry, all united against that absolute rule.
Or the civil rights movement. Activists, lawyers, politicians working together.
It's that collective power that makes a difference.
It's about having a critical mass of people committed to that change.
Yeah.
And having the means to make their voices heard.
Because those voices need to be amplified.
And that power can take many forms, right?
Oh, absolutely. Political organizing, legal challenges, economic boycotts, even social protests.
There's a whole spectrum of tactics they can use.
The authors argue that the more diverse and inclusive that coalition is, the better their chances of success.
Makes sense. But it also makes you wonder, why don't these broad coalitions form more often? If extractive institutions are so bad for the majority, why aren't people constantly rising up to demand something better?
It's a good question. And it goes to the heart of why these systems persist for so long.
Because you'd think people would be fed up.
You'd think so, right? But those in power, they're not just sitting idly by. They often find very effective ways to divide people.
Divide and conquer.
Exactly. Exploit ethnic or religious differences.
Create those economic disparities that make it hard for people to see their shared interests.
It's much harder to challenge the status quo when everyone's at each other's throats.
So keep everyone distracted and infighting.
And let's not forget about good old-fashioned repression. Violence.
Dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, they often resort to those tactics.
Fear and intimidation, silence dissent, crush opposition. It's effective, sadly.
And then there's propaganda, misinformation, control the narrative.
They exert control over the media, education systems, limit access to alternative viewpoints.
It's almost like brainwashing people to accept the existing order, make them think there's no other way.
It can be incredibly effective, especially when you combine it with those other forms of control.
So those are the powerful forces that prevent those broad coalitions from forming in the first place.
And that's why those systems are so darn resilient. Change is a constant uphill battle.
It's a bit discouraging when you lay it all out like that.
It's true. It's tough.
Yeah.
But the authors aren't saying change is impossible. It's just really, really hard.
And it takes understanding those dynamics of power, creating those conditions for inclusive institutions to take root.
It's about being strategic, persistent.
So while we shouldn't underestimate the challenges, we can't give up hope either. There are those possibilities for a better future. We have to believe that.
Exactly. And understanding these patterns, the factors that contribute to success and failure, that's where it starts.
Knowledge is power.
It can help us make more informed choices, push for change in more effective ways.
So we've talked about those internal dynamics, the external pressures, the challenges of breaking free. But I'm curious about the role of foreign aid. Where does that fit into this whole equation?
Foreign aid. That's a tricky one, and the authors have some strong opinions on that too.
If we want to help those developing nations, those struggling with those extractive institutions, shouldn't we be providing assistance?
You'd think so, right? But the authors argued that it's not so simple. In fact, they suggest that simply providing aid to countries with those extractive institutions, it can actually backfire.
How so?
It often ends up bolstering the very regimes that are causing the problems in the first place.
Because those corrupt leaders just pocket the money. It's like throwing it into a black hole.
Exactly. The aid doesn't reach the people who need it, it just strengthens the grip of those in power.
So what's the alternative? Do we just abandon those countries to their fate?
No, not at all. The authors are calling for a paradigm shift in how we approach development assistance. We need to be smarter about it.
So it's not just about writing checks, it's about being more strategic.
Exactly. We need to focus on supporting those initiatives that foster inclusive institutions. That's where the real impact lies.
So prioritize aid that empowers people.
Strengthens civil society organizations, promotes transparency and accountability.
Invest in the people and institutions that can create lasting change, not just put a Band-Aid on the problem.
Precisely. It's about addressing those root causes, not just the symptoms.
This makes me think about the responsibility of those developed nations. It's not just about providing aid, it's about recognizing how their own policies might be contributing to the problem.
That's an important point.
The authors talk about how those historical factors, colonialism, the slave trade, they continue to cast a long shadow.
They've shaped the development trajectories of so many nations.
And contemporary practices, like those unfair trade agreements supporting corrupt regimes, they can undermine the efforts of those developing countries to build better systems.
We need to be more mindful of those unintended consequences.
It's a call for greater awareness, greater responsibility on the part of those developed nations. We have a role to play in creating a more level playing field.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that interconnectedness, acknowledging that our actions have ripple effects. We can't just turn a blind eye.
This conversation has really driven home that point. It's a complex web of factors, that's for sure.
There's no easy answer. It's not a simple equation. But the more we understand those complexities, the better equipped we are to make those informed choices.
Welcome back to our final part. We've explored a lot, from those contrasting institutions to those inspiring stories of nations breaking free. Now, let's think about, well, what can we actually do with all these insights? How do we apply this knowledge to create a more, just and prosperous world?
One thing that stuck with me is the emphasis on empowering people. Fostering that bottom-up pressure for change.
Right, so it's not just about waiting for those at the top to get it.
Exactly. It's about the people demanding a better future, making their voices heard.
And history's full of examples where this has worked, right? Social movements, for example. What can we learn from those?
Social movements are a prime example. They've been absolutely instrumental in challenging those extractive institutions, pushing for inclusivity.
You see it time and again.
Think about the civil rights movement here in the U.S., the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, those pro-democracy movements that swept through Eastern Europe.
Those were real turning points. People facing incredible risks to stand up for what they believed in.
It's incredibly inspiring. Their courage and determination, it forced those in power to make those concessions.
To listen to the people.
To create more inclusive systems.
It wasn't just about those protests and demonstrations, though, right? I mean, they used other strategies as well.
Absolutely. Legal challenges, economic boycotts. They even formed alliances with those international actors. It's about using all the tools at your disposal.
Those successful movements, they're multifaceted. They draw upon all sorts of approaches and resources. It's about being strategic.
And persistent. It's a long game.
And these movements, they're not just about those big dramatic overthrows of power.
Right, yeah.
They're also about strengthening those inclusive institutions, making sure they don't backslide,
Absolutely.
preventing things from going back to the way they were. The authors point to the labor movement as a prime example, right?
The labor movement, yeah. They were instrumental in securing workers' rights, improving conditions,
Fighting for that fair treatment.
or the environmental movement. They pushed governments, corporations, everyone to be more sustainable.
So it's a constant process.
It is.
It doesn't just stop once you achieve a certain level of progress.
You have to stay vigilant, engaged.
Those inclusive institutions, they're not static. They need to be nurtured and protected from those who would undermine them.
There are always those who benefit from the old ways. They'll try to resist change.
And that makes me think about the role of the media.
Yeah.
Earlier, we talked about how those extractive institutions, they manipulate the media, spread that propaganda. But in those societies with a free and independent press, that's where the media can really empower people.
It can hold those in power accountable.
Shine a light on that corruption, highlight those injustices.
Amplify those voices that are so often, well, silenced.
It's about giving a platform to those who need it most.
And it creates that space for open debate and discussion.
Allows people to form their own opinions.
It's essential for a healthy democracy, that's for sure.
So we've seen how those social movements, that citizen engagement, a free press, they all play a crucial role.
It's about creating that environment where inclusivity can thrive.
But what about education? Where does that fit into all of this?
Oh, the authors emphasize education, big time. It's vital on multiple fronts.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
Firstly, those inclusive institutions, they're more likely to invest in education in the first place.
Because they recognize the value of an educated citizenry.
Exactly. It's fundamental for that economic growth, for social progress.
We saw that in Botswana, for instance. They made it a priority, and look at the results.
Impressive literacy rates.
And secondly, they argue that education, well, it can empower people to challenge those extractive institutions.
Knowledge is power, as they say.
When you have information, when you understand your rights, you're more likely to question authority.
To organize effectively for change, education is key.
It's not just about those job skills either.
It's about cultivating critical thinking skills.
Encouraging people to participate in civic life, promoting those values of tolerance and inclusivity. It's about shaping citizens.
Who are engaged, informed, and ready to make a difference.
And that brings us to our own individual responsibility.
Right. We all have a part to play in this.
It's not enough to just sit back and passively consume information. We need to be active participants.
We have to seek out that knowledge, engage in critical thinking, challenge injustice wherever we encounter it. Silence is complicity.
Creating a more just and prosperous world, it's not just about those big systemic changes. It's about how each of us interacts with the world around us, those choices we make every single day.
You're right. It's about aligning our actions with our values.
So it's a call to action for all of us, regardless of where we live, what our circumstances are.
We all have something to contribute. No effort is too small.
We can support those social movements, participate in civic life, demand better from our leaders, promote education, access to information. It all matters.
And we can make conscious choices,
Absolutely.
Support businesses that are doing the right thing, make ethical investments, and of course, speak out against injustice. Use your voice.
It's about recognizing that interconnectedness. We're all in this together.
Our actions, even those that seem small, they have ripple effects. Don't underestimate your own power to make a difference.
This deep dive into why nations fail has been quite a journey. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. From those historical patterns to those possibilities for the future.
But the biggest takeaway for me, it's that reminder of human agency.
That we're not just passive bystanders. We have the power to shape our own destiny.
To create a better future. And if you're looking for a book that will challenge you, inspire you, make you want to get involved, this is it.
Why Nations Fail. Highly recommend it.
And as you engage with these ideas, keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Ask questions, explore different perspectives.
There's always more to learn.
There's no easy answers to those complex challenges, that's for sure. But by working together, by learning from history, by embracing inclusivity,
we can create a more just and prosperous future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it enlightening.
Inspiring.
And we hope it sparked that desire for positive change.
Until next time.
Keep those knowledge gears turning.